Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brendan from Grain Producers SA. Thank you for joining us today on our second webinar series that we're hosting in regards to the fuel and fertiliser crisis situation at the moment. Today I've got two people from the industry who can give us their best guess and their best update as the current situation stands today. Firstly, we're going to hear from Rowan Lee, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Australasian Convenience and Petroleum Marketers Association. That's the national body and voice for fuel distributors, wholesalers, retailers, and suppliers. So they see the gamut of fuel supply line across Australia. So keen to hear from Rowan. And then after Rowan, we'll hear from Rebecca Duff, who's a Senior Associate at Mellor Olsson, who will walk through contracts, particularly force majeure, which seems to be a word of the day constantly at the moment in anyone who's dealing with their contracts for either fuel or fertiliser. As our last session as well, we have a Q&A box available. So if you have any questions, please put your questions into the Q&A box and I'll address them at the end. But for now, I think we've got a few attendees in there. This session will be recorded. It'll be online, I'm hoping, by tomorrow morning. But we'll throw to Rowan, who's, as I said, the Chief Executive Officer of the Australasian Convenience and Petroleum Marketers Association. Thanks, Rowan.
Thanks, Brendan. I'd like to paint a picture of how the fuel industry in Australia is structured. Most people think, you've got the big majors of BP, Ampol, Caltex and so on. In fact, 30% of service stations are actually only company operated, company owned. 70% are run and operated by small and medium-sized businesses. They could be based in, say, Dubbo or Port Hedland or Mildura or wherever. So the vast bulk of the fuel retailers in the country are small and medium-sized businesses. So even though they might carry the brand of BP, Ampol, or Shell, or just on the pricing structure in terms of the fuel price excise decrease we just had on 1st of April. Essentially, 51 cents of every dollar of fuel that you buy, 51 cents is in fuel excise. And on top of the 51 cents is a GST, so it's a tax on a tax. So that's half your dollar of fuel, and then you get up to your wholesale costs, transport costs, and so on, and you're up to about 85 cents in the dollar. The remaining 15 cents is what you call the indicative retail margin. So the last 15 cents is where the retailer then pays their labour costs, their utilities, their insurance, their lease, all the rest of the stuff, and you end up with about 1.5 to 3 cents a litre profit from that. And that's been pretty steady for the last 15 years since the ACCC has been monitoring that. The ACCC has complete visibility of wholesale and retail prices, and they normally put out a quarterly report on fuel pricing in Australia at the wholesale and retail level. Over the past few weeks, they've been doing those reports on a weekly basis, just to bring greater transparency to the industry. Prior to the Middle East crisis, just the Australian fuel supply industry, where do we get our fuel from? 55% of our fuel comes out of Singapore, where it is often, that's the trading desk for our region. But also it's where a lot of refining is undertaken as well. So in Singapore, the fuel will come out of Indonesia, South Korea, China, Malaysia, Brunei, etc. A whole range of countries comes into Singapore, and then from there the ships come down to Australia. Interestingly enough, 30% of our diesel comes out of South Korea alone. And it was comforting to hear early last week that the Koreans said that they would honour 2025 monthly allocations for export. We're a little bit concerned that if the Koreans pulled back on their export allocations, that we might be in a bit of trouble here in Australia. So that was comforting. So that's where our fuel comes from. Post the crisis, the majors are having to be a little bit more imaginative, but also it will be reflected in price. I think there's about 4 boats that are coming out of the Gulf Coast. That's the old Gulf of Mexico, down the coast, and then through the Panama Canal, then right across the Pacific to Australia. That is expensive. So when the government talks about supply is not a problem, that's probably correct, but price is going to be a problem. And I know another major has also bought another ship out of Argentina, for example. So, there is a bit of flexibility there. They've been fairly imaginative. This is going to change the way we look at our fuel supplies for a long time to come. So that's really where we are at. I don't know this has been. I've spoken to someone who's been in the game for 50 years and operates in regional Australia, New South Wales, South Australia, and Victoria. And in the first week, I asked him, have we ever seen anything like this before? And he just said no. We're in absolutely uncharted waters. So that's basically where we are with the industry at the moment. I'll leave it back to questions, Brendan. Brendan, would you like me to just talk about what happened early in the crisis? Perhaps I should do that. There was a run on supply very early, and we thought it was a lot of people forward buying. In the cities, you probably call it panic buying, but in the regions, in the ag sector, freight and commercial sectors, people were forward buying. So what they normally buy in, say, April or May, they were buying in March. So that really had a heavy impact on our fuel stocks at that time. So a lot of pressure there. There was also a huge increase in demand. That was sort of up 25 to 30%. But you only had the same size tanker fleet that you had the week before the crisis started. So they were at breaking point. So they were very highly stretched in terms of the supply chain. So that's what we saw happen there as well. 94% of service stations in Australia, as of this morning, have all grades of fuel available. And those that do have a stock out of one fuel grade or another, generally will have that back within 24, 48 hours. So they're generally just temporary outages. I'll leave it there, Brendan.
Thank you, Rowan. Rebecca, I'll just move you to be in front there. Thanks, Rowan. Rebecca, Senior Associate at Mellor Olsson, will talk to us about contracts. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks. I'll just remember how to share my screen again. Hopefully. Is that showing up?
That's coming up, yep. And they just present that. There we go, done.
Thank you. So I'm just going to run through some of the basics of contract law, which may be relevant to you at the moment. I know that a lot of you have been asking questions about force majeure clauses, so I'll touch on that, but I just want to run through the basics. What are the actual terms of your contract and what to do if there's a breach or whether you're in breach, and then what your rights are for rectifying a breach. So most of you will know that your contracts may be partially verbal, partially written, and partially implied. But for most of us who are party to a supply contract, all the terms are going to be recorded in that contract, except for those that are implied by law. So all contracts that we're party to have some terms implied by law. It's impossible to contract out of the law. For example, the terms that will be implied by law to your contracts will be things like the goods are reasonably fit for the purposes for which they've been supplied, or terms that might be implied by the facts of the contract. So terms that are so necessary for the contract to be performed and so obvious that it goes without saying, but they're not actually recorded in the contract. Those terms might be implied in your contract as well. So if you're party to a supply contract, most of your terms will be those that are written in the contract. The summary of all the advice I'm going to give you is read your contract, then read it again, and then maybe even read it again, because the terms that we think are in there sometimes aren't, and sometimes there's terms in there that we had no idea were in there. Just to be, this is a summary of just recognising what the terms of your contract are, and I am just going over this because I reckon most of the clients I speak to think that they know what's in their contract until they actually bring it in for us to have a look at, and they're often surprised. So when there are written terms in your contract and you sign it or you accept it by placing an order, including where there's terms on a website and you go and place an order, you don't have to sign the contract to be bound by it. You're evincing your intention to the other party to be bound by those terms. So when you read your contract, read it carefully and check for words that are absolute and words that have discretion. So, for example, does the contract say that the supplier may provide you with fuel or fertiliser, or does it say that the supplier must? Often larger contracts provide a significant amount of discretion for the supplier or for the purchaser, if the purchaser is someone like Coles or Woolworths. So just as you're reading through it, check whether there is an obligation or whether there's a discretion for the other party. Check whether pricing is fixed or whether the other party can unilaterally amend the pricing. So some contracts say the price is as set out in the schedule unless agreed otherwise in writing between the parties. So that pricing is fixed, and the party not supplying for that pricing would be in breach. But some contracts might say the supplier will notify the purchaser of prices from time to time by publishing them on their website or by notice or by some other mechanism. So the pricing in that contract's not fixed and the supplier's got discretion to vary its prices. And one of the big things that can happen with contracts are terms being imported just by reference. I hope you can see this. The font is a little bit small, but you can see in this clause 4.2 of this contract, it says, to the extent possible, you will comply with and won't cause us not to comply with the Coles policies and procedures. So all of the Coles policies and procedures, if you go to the definitions in this contract, you can click a link and it takes you to a page that's got links to all of their documents, and they're not small. So when you're reading through your contract, just look out for things like that, because you're actually bound by all of those policies and procedures, even though they're not set out in your contract. This is actually a really important point when we're thinking about terms that might be printed on the back of a purchase order or an invoice. I've just referred to a case there back from 2004 where Toll, as a freight company, provided its terms and conditions to an agent for Alpha Farm, and the salesman and Alpha Farm had a discussion together, and the freight was booked and certain terms were published on the purchase order. But on the back of the purchase order were some really, in very small font but legible, significant terms that included things like Toll is not liable for any loss caused, no matter who caused it, even though that wasn't what was agreed between the parties verbally or on the front of the order form. Because the agent for Alpha Farm signed that document and because the terms were there on the back, those terms were binding. So you just need to be really careful when you're thinking that you're striking an agreement or making a deal, that you have considered all of the terms. The court in that case said it doesn't matter what you subjectively thought. You had a conversation with a salesman or you had a conversation with an agent or an employee and they told you something different. It doesn't really matter because you've agreed by signing that purchase order or by placing an order online to all of their terms. So you do just need to do the boring thing and take note of all of those written terms. There's another type of clause in contracts that cause some grief. This is an entire contract clause or an entire agreement. And basically, this clause says that all of those discussions that you were having with the land agent or the sales agent or all of those emails that went back and forward don't mean anything unless they make it into that final written agreement. Another important thing to look out for, the number of times clients think that certain things are terms of the contract or certain exclusions apply or they have certain assurances, but they don't, because all of those emails didn't make it into the contract, and there's a clause like this, an entire agreement clause, which basically says that everything else is off except for what's written in the agreement. So those little points are important to note. And the other thing that's important to note is when things are going well and everyone's got plenty of whatever they're supplying or plenty of cash and the relationship is good, it's often the case that parties to a contract will both be in breach of the contract. There's a contract signed, it's in the filing cabinet, but everyone's going along well and no one's too worried about the fact that, you know, we're not supplying within 3 days or we're not paying the invoice within 14 days or whatever. Just be aware that the fact that no one complies with those clauses doesn't actually vary the clauses, and it's usually when things go badly that everyone pulls the document out of the filing cabinet. And there's usually a clause in there that says just because we haven't been, you know, we've been accepting your breach for years doesn't mean that we waive our rights. So just be aware of that. Just because parties haven't been complying with the terms of the agreement doesn't mean that the terms of the agreement have been varied. And there is one clause that turns up in some contracts, but not all, and it's called a force majeure. Basically refers to circumstances that's beyond the control of the party to an agreement, and it affects the party's ability to perform the agreement. And we'll all be aware of recent examples from the COVID pandemic. Everyone suddenly became really good at force majeure clauses during COVID. So the concept of force majeure doesn't exist in the common law, doesn't exist in any statute. It only exists if it's specifically written into your contract. So if your contract doesn't have one and the other party says, I can't comply with the agreement because of force majeure and it's not in the contract, then that can't apply. It is literally just if the parties have agreed that certain things will happen if there's something that's beyond their control. So it's limited in that it has to specifically be worded in there. Something we learned from COVID is that we had ignored force majeure clauses for a very long time because we've had a fairly good run here in Australia for a while from a contract law perspective. But increasingly, these are back on the agenda and people are examining them carefully. So if a force majeure clause is not included, it doesn't apply. But even if it is included, it literally will only be or give the parties the rights that are, and I'm sorry, this is small again, but it'll only give the parties the rights that the force majeure clause specifically says. If you Google it, you'll find a whole range of different types of force majeure clauses. But in a nutshell, if there's something that is outside of the control of one of the parties, such as a war or a global pandemic, and that party just can't perform their part of the contract anymore, it usually gives that party who's affected the right to suspend their obligations. And in this clause, it says if there's anything that's beyond the reasonable control of that party, which is a bit vague and probably worth fighting about, then the party has to notify the other party that they're subject to a force majeure event, and their obligations under the contract are suspended for a time. And then it usually provides, we get down to clause 1.4 there, it usually provides that if we still aren't in any better position after a certain amount of time, 3 months or 6 months or whatever, then either party can terminate the contract. Another example is this one just came off Google yesterday because it has the words war and invasion in there. This one is actually pretty standard. I see a lot like this where it says that neither party is liable if something like a war or invasion happens. Then the obligations of that party are suspended for a time. This clause is pretty rubbish because it doesn't actually say for how long and whether a party has a right to terminate. But that's basically how these force majeure clauses work. It's really hard to give you a general summary of what to do if there's a force majeure clause because they are all really different. If it says something beyond the reasonable control of the party, well, fuel pricing may or may not fall within that. It's worth thinking about it in your situation, whether that applies. And then this example where it says, okay, war, invasion, terrorist threats and hostilities, we probably fall in that, but then what are the rights of the parties? So you just really need to go through that force majeure clause, if you have one, with a fine-tooth comb and just see what the rights of the parties are. Usually the party that's claiming a force majeure has to provide you with written notice and they have to set out what the force majeure is. Just because fuel is more difficult to come by or more expensive might not necessarily amount to a force majeure. You can't just rely on a force majeure clause necessarily because you've struck a bad bargain or it's becoming more expensive for you to comply with the obligations under the contract. So if you're party to a contract and someone gives you notice that they're exercising their rights under the force majeure clause, you read that clause carefully and critically. And if you don't agree that they have a right, then I would get some legal advice, but to communicate that with the other party as soon as possible. There may or may not be a lot you can do about it. If it was found theoretically by a court later on that the force majeure clause wasn't enlivened and that one party had, wrongly tried to exercise their rights, they would technically be in breach and then you could sue them for breach. But, that is purely theoretical because there might not be much you can do about it. Okay, so that is force majeure clauses in a nutshell. My advice is read it again. And also just remember, if it's not in the contract, there's no such thing as force majeure. It is only in there if you guys have drafted it in and agreed to it. Breach of contract is something which is fairly technical. And sometimes a preliminary view of a contract might be the other party's in breach, therefore I'm going to terminate. You just need to be really careful with this. Your contract might provide you with certain obligations to follow in the event of one party's breach, but even if it doesn't, there is a requirement at law that you need to provide a breaching party with the opportunity to remedy that breach before you can have any rights to terminate. The consequences of wrongfully terminating a contract could be worse for you than remaining party to a contract which is, not in your favour. So in the event that a party is in breach of a contract, and you've read the contract really carefully and you're absolutely certain that they are in breach, you'd be getting legal advice, but the first thing you'd be doing would be providing that other party with a notice to remedy the breach and then providing them with a reasonable amount of time to remedy it. So reasonable will depend on the circumstances. For an urgent thing, it would be days, for something, breach of a non-payment of rent in a lease, you have to give them 2 weeks and that sort of thing. So you do need to provide that opportunity to remedy the breach. Just seek legal advice. Don't seek to terminate a contract for breach unless you have sought some legal advice. Even if you go to terminate the contract for a breach, it needs to be breach of a material term. It can't just be for breach of something that's not material to the whole contract. There is another concept of in contract law called frustration. This is a common law doctrine that the courts will consider if a contract becomes impossible, absolutely impossible to perform. So this is something which people are increasingly interested in at the moment, is this concept of frustration. But my comments about this is it's extremely rare. The courts, when they've looked at it, there's some seminal cases from the High Court where there's one to do with the building of the New South Wales rail network where the contractor couldn't do what they were supposed to do because there'd been a change in the law, and the court still said, oh, well, it's a commercial contract, find a way around it. So I'll mention frustration because people are asking about it, but frustration requires that the performance of a party's obligations under the contract have become absolutely impossible or so fundamentally different that it's not actually the deal that was struck at the beginning. So frustration won't arise just because a contract becomes financially ruinous to perform. It has to be radically different from the bargain that you struck. So I've put in there that a bad bargain doesn't amount to frustration. You can't set a contract aside just because you're going to lose money or run it at a loss. You've struck the bargain, you're aware of all of the information that the whole market had, and if you made a bad deal, bad luck is basically what the courts have said. So just be aware of frustration. It might be that it might apply to your contract, but definitely get legal advice. This is a fairly technical area of contract law, and so I'm just raising it because it's out there, but I wouldn't be expecting many of your contracts to be able to be set aside because of this. And then the termination of the contract. I'm not sure whether the main concern for people is as a consumer trying to get fuel and fertiliser, or whether there is a converse trying to meet obligations under supply agreements where you are the supplier. But if you are looking to terminate a contract, it needs to only be pursuant to the terms of the contract. So it might be set out in your contract what steps you need to take in order to terminate. Might be, if it's not, then you need to only terminate pursuant to a material breach by the other side, or seek to have the contract set aside due to frustration or force majeure. So there's no statutory right in Australia to terminate contracts. You need to be careful because the other party might sue you for wrongful termination. If you do get to the stage where you want to terminate a contract for breach or pursuant to its terms, this is one area where I really suggest just biting the bullet and paying someone, a lawyer, to help you with that, even if it's just to explain to you how that would work. And that's my quick 101 of contract law, especially around force majeure and frustration and breach. People often say, oh, well, if someone's in breach, we'll terminate the contract and I'll sue for losses. And yes, that is possible. My recommendation, that's expensive, probably worth more than, even what you were planning to get out of the contract. But one thing that is possible is to use your legal rights under the contract to try and work out a commercial solution with the other party. So my advice again is just read the contract, read it again, figure out exactly what you hope to achieve, not necessarily what your rights are under the contract, because that might not be realistic. What are you hoping to achieve? Get some legal advice, even if it's just someone to review your contract and give you your options, and then use your legal rights, not so much to sue or seek legal damages, but really to find a commercial solution. So using those potential legal options to find a commercial solution with the other party. And that's it. You'll be pleased to know.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Can you just stop sharing your screen? I'll see the main one there. Much appreciated, both of you, Rowan and Rebecca. Thank you. I've got some questions. It won't take long at all, I don't think. Firstly, to you, Rebecca, in regards to force majeure. In Western Australia, there's a major fertiliser supplier that is called force majeure on its contracts over there. In my mind, they probably called it maybe 1 to 2 weeks ago. And a lot of the criticism that they're receiving is that it was somewhat premature to lean on the clause of force majeure. I guess I've got 2 questions on that. Is there a threshold to when force majeure can be called upon? Because I can't, sometimes it could be a convenience thing. Obviously, everyone knows there's a war going on, but if they haven't just done the work to try and rectify the situation themselves, is there a way that it could be contested in that sort of sense by the parties to that contract?
Yeah, sure. So they don't have a right to rely on force majeure other than the actual words written in their contract. So if their contract doesn't say, in the event of hostilities which may affect the profitability for us under this contract, we may, provide you with notice of force majeure, then they might not have an opportunity to rely on their force majeure clauses. A lot of force majeure clauses are like, they're the last thing we think about. We work out all the commercial terms and we work out all the really interesting bits, and then we work a force majeure clause in there. So often they are lackluster, and I wouldn't want to be the party trying to rely on it. If I had been provided with a notice that someone was relying on a force majeure clause, I would read the clause, and if I suspected that they had acted prematurely and they were just trying to avoid a bad bargain, I would get legal advice and then write to them, contact them saying, you can't rely on this clause, this is not open to you, and you're actually in breach of the agreement at the moment by not fulfilling your end of the bargain, and use that as a starting point. They might not be expecting anyone to do that, but definitely with any clause, with any, unless it's really clear, like paying rent, with any clause, it's open to interpretation, and I wouldn't accept something just because the other side says this is what has happened. So yeah, I would definitely query that.
Cool. If there has been a force majeure clause call made, and the circumstances have been that I guess clause of the force majeure have now changed. So in a fantasy world, the war's ended and everyone goes back to as they were a month ago or so. But there's no impediment now anymore. Could the contract simply just continue on as it was previously?
Yeah, so force majeure usually gives people a right to suspend their obligations, but not to terminate. So it might, but let's just assume that it gives a party a right to suspend their obligations to supply for 2 months or whatever. And then after 2 months, if it's still persisting, then the party that's affected can seek to terminate the agreement. That's usually how they're drafted. If the agreement's not terminated pursuant to the force majeure clause and that force majeure event ends, hostilities simmer down or whatever, that contract should still be on foot if it hasn't been terminated, and the parties can continue. And then if some other drama happens, that's a separate force majeure event, and they have to go through the whole process again. The only exception to that is if the force majeure clause gives the affected party, the one who's saying that they're subject to a force majeure, the right to terminate. So there might be a clause that says if a force majeure event occurs and we provide you with notice, we can then immediately terminate the agreement. I've never seen one like that, but if it said that, then they could terminate. Otherwise, the contract remains on foot, and the understanding is that they need to pick up their obligations again when that event has ended. That's definitely a point of negotiation. If I was on the other side of that, I'd be writing to them saying, we're in a new equilibrium now. You need to continue to provide services or whatever the contract's for.
Whatever it was.
Yeah.
Back to as it was before. Thanks for that. I guess really the theme of your presentation today was to read the contract, read it again, make sure that you understand all the terms and whether things are absolute or variable or there's discretion there. And I think one of your slides there had the word that would probably answer this question, but does war need to be declared for it to be used as a justification for force majeure? So if in the contract it said, I think one of the slides you had there said war hostilities, even if war is not declared, could be an event to cause force majeure.
Again, it's all just like if one African nation declares war on another African nation, I couldn't cease providing legal services under my contract to a client because that war literally doesn't affect my ability to perform my obligations under the contract. So it is going to really depend on the circumstances. The onus is on the person seeking to rely on the force majeure clause to draw a direct line between their, force majeure clause and their ability to suspend providing or fulfilling their obligations under the contract. Otherwise, they're just plain and simple in breach. So wars, even if it does say the word war or hostilities, it has to have an impact on your ability to provide services or fulfill your obligations under the contract. Not just a random concept of, some unrelated war, therefore I don't have to worry about fulfilling my obligations.
Even in the case of what we have in the Middle East, I don't think that's necessarily declared war. Everyone understands that they are at war, but I don't think, say, the US has not gone through Congress to declare war on Iran in this case. They've joined a coalition with Israel against Iran. So therefore, to put it in very simple terms, the paperwork declaring this as a war is not there, but clearly all the other aspects of warlike activity are ongoing there.
And clauses will either be really vague and broadly drafted, like anything which stops us from being able to fulfill our obligations, or they'll be really specific. And if a lawyer has sat there and written war, they're also going to write hostility, terror events, international relations and all that sort of thing. So, I think it's just the main thing is being able to draw a direct line or a fairly direct line between the event and your inability to fulfill your obligations.
Easy. Thanks for that. Rowan, obviously fuel is the key topic of the moment, along with fertiliser. Is there any, I guess, you spoke about that there's some, sorry, I've written my notes here, some 94% of all fuel stations in the country have all their fuel available. And for those that don't, they can probably fix that in the next 24 hours if they were to go out. So it seems like the bottlenecks and the supply shock we had at the start of this war in the Middle East has somewhat either smoothed out or been able to rectify in the background to ensure that constant supply to the retailers and to the field.
Brendan, there was a lot of scrambling that was going on. The old duck on the pond sort of analogy. But I've got to say, in South Australia, you actually have it pretty good. The terminals at Birkenhead are shared, so it's not like a Viva terminal or a Caltex terminal or a Chevron terminal. So there's excellent storage capacity down there. And also the terminal shared. So the ships come out of Hong Kong, down to the West Australian coast, across the Bight and straight into Adelaide. So that's the route they take. But the setup in Adelaide is so good that, and also partly geographic regions, that essentially South Australia supplies service stations in northern Victoria and southern and western New South Wales as well. So it's not just South Australia that's being supplied out of Adelaide. You're supplying into Victoria and southern and western New South Wales. So the South Australian setup's actually pretty good in terms of those supplies. What we had also was a major price shock, and when I talk about demand being so high, the price of gas oil 10 parts per million, which is the refined diesel product in Singapore, that went from $80 a barrel prior to the conflict to almost overnight to where it is now, which is $232. So it's almost tripled. And that's been reflected at the terminal gate. In Adelaide on Monday, 2 days ago, the terminal gate price of diesel was $3.01 at 0.5, 301.5, and today it's 320.6. So it's gone up essentially 19 cents in 48 hours. So that when that was happening at the start of the process, I'm saying what I'm pointing out is still going on. It's going to have a long tail to this. But when this first happened, there was huge demand, and people quite rightly thinking the price is going to continue rising. So I might as well buy here before the price gets to there. The other part that's just happened today, as we've probably heard, is that Iran and the US have agreed to open up the Straits of Hormuz for 2 weeks. That is good, but don't get your hopes up. This is going to have a very, very long tail. What I mean by don't get your hopes up is those ships will be able to get out of the Straits of Hormuz, but who's going to go back in? That's the question. You know, so a lot of questions to be asked around it.
In the constant sort of flux of international news as well, the Federal Treasurer, if not today, probably maybe yesterday, went to Japan, I think, to sign a fuel supply agreement. And I think something's also being sort of built up with the Singapore government as well. And you touched on that the supply, how much we have coming in from Singapore. I think it's something like 55% comes from Singapore. So again, that's all just shoring up supply and I guess building security of availability of fuel in Australia.
Yeah, I'm not into the details of that necessarily. My understanding is that it's a bit of a reminder that we export a lot of natural gas to those markets, and we bring liquid fuels our way. So I think it might have just been sort of reminding them about the two-way trade and then need to look after your trading partners.
Very good.
People often talk, I'll just get ahead of the curve a little bit, Brendan. People often talk about why don't we have 90-day supply, on shore. And that's a good question. And it's a question that no government has been willing to answer for 20 years or more, or perhaps go back to the 70s even. I'll just put it down to being, it does come at a cost. That would come at a cost because essentially you're asking an oil major to buy product, whether it be crude or refined, put it in a big tank and hold on to it, not in a revenue stream out of it for 90 days and then out it goes, something like that. It's a bit like an insurance policy on your house. You can have a basic cover, which is what you do on for most things, or you can have the gold-plated insurance policy. Essentially, this is no different. This argument's no real different to that. So, yes, you can do it. It'll come as a cost to the consumer. What that would be, I don't know. But, it's just that's another way of thinking about that.
Does the out of the minimum stock holding, there was some 20% release. Does that, I guess that sort of calmed some of the initial shock maybe 2 weeks ago when they sort of released that from the petrol companies, from the oil companies. Does that minimum stock holding need to be looked at, need to be adjusted again, or we're waiting for another sort of major event out of this war before they start contemplating something again?
Yeah, there's a number of different parts to that, but that minimum stock holding obligation was filled up when prices were relatively cheap. If you said that we have to going to replenish that stock today to get back to where we were, that's going to be you're going to be replenishing fuel is going to be very, very, very expensive. So do you do it now or do you do it later? So that did take a bit of pressure out of the system. I think it just calmed the market more than anything, more an act of perception than anything else. The constructive considering the fuel quality standards, where as of December 14 last year, we had to have 10 parts per million sulfur content in our fuel. Previous to that was 50 parts per million. Ampol was still manufacturing 50 parts per million fuel and exporting it to Asia Pacific. By relaxing those higher fuel quality standards, Ampol was able to release 200 million litres into the Australian market away from export. So a couple of initiatives like that were pretty important at the start of the whole crisis, if you like. So yeah, there's been a couple of initiatives there, but as I said, the MSO will have to be restocked at some time. To what level? That's really a decision for government, but it will come at a cost to consumers.
I don't have any other further questions, but other than to say thank you for both for your time today. Rebecca from Mellor Olsson and Rowan from the Australian Convenience and Petroleum Marketers Association, Australasian Association. But both thank you both for your time.
Great. Thanks very much, Brendan.
Thank you.